I have always respected Sony, not because it always won, but because it repeatedly chose to reinvent itself before the world forced it to. And that instinct is rarer than genius. Sony's history is not a clean ascent from radios to PlayStation. It is a long sequence of bets made under uncertainty by people who refuse to accept that technology should only serve efficiency instead of imagination. Sony was never just an electronics company. It was a cultural experiment, disguised as hardware, and its story begins not with dominance, but with ruin. Tokyo in 1945 was broken, bombed, humiliated, industry was rubble. Morale was ash. In that environment, Masaru Ibuka and Akio Morita didn't talk about building an empire. They talked about fixing things, literally. Radios, equipment, whatever could be repaired to bring a little function back into daily life. Their first company, Tokyo Tsushin Kogyo, wasn't glamorous. It was survival engineering. But embedded in that survival was a belief that would define Sony for decades. Technology should make people feel something, not just work. Their first major success, the transistor radio, wasn't impressive by Western standards. American companies already had better versions. What Sony did differently was shrink it, humanize it, and imagine a future where technology traveled with you instead of anchoring you to a room. Portable radios weren't just products, they were statements. Music could follow you. Information could move. Personal space could exist alongside technology. That shift seems obvious now. It was radical then. Sony wasn't competing on specs, it was competing on experience. This pattern repeated again and again. Walkman, Trinitron, Discman. Each time Sony didn't ask what the market wanted, it asked what people didn't yet realize they could want. The Walkman in particular is misunderstood as a product success. It was a cultural provocation. Critics mocked it. Who would walk around listening to music alone? Sony answered without debate. Millions of people did. The Walkman didn't just sell. It rewired behavior. It normalized private immersion in public spaces. That is not electronics. That is social engineering. What made Sony dangerous to competitors was its comfort living between categories. It didn't respect the boundaries between hardware, software, and content. Music labels were acquired, movie studios were bought, gaming consoles were built. From a traditional management perspective, this looked unfocused. From Sony's internal logic, it was inevitable. If technology shapes experience, then controlling both the device and the content was not greed, it was coherence. Sony wanted to orchestrate the full emotional arc from creation to consumption. But this ambition carried a cost. As Sony grew, its internal complexity exploded. Hardware divisions didn't always talk to content divisions. Pride hardened into silos. The same company that invented portable freedom began tripping over its own structure. This is the part of Sony's history people gloss over. Innovation slowed, not because Sony lost talent, but because success created internal friction. When you are good at many things, choosing what not to do becomes the hardest discipline of all. Then came the digital shift. MP3s, file sharing, the internet. Sony, ironically, was uniquely positioned to lead this era. It owned music, it owned devices, and yet it hesitated. Fear of cannibalizing existing revenue streams paralyzed decision-making. Protecting CDs mattered more than empowering users. This hesitation allowed others to define the rules. Apple didn't beat Sony on technology. It beat Sony on courage. It was willing to sacrifice old models to own new behavior. Sony watched knowing better, moving slower. And yet this is not a story of decline. It is a story of selective survival. Where Sony stumbled in music players, it roared back in gaming. The PlayStation was born not from dominance, but from rejection. A failed partnership with Nintendo forced Sony to choose retreat or commit fully to an industry it didn't control. Sony committed, and in doing so, it returned to its original instinct-build technology that feels intuitive, emotional, and immersive. PlayStation wasn't just a console. It was a platform for identity competition and community. This is where the through line becomes clear. From radios to PlayStation, Sony's true product was never hardware. It was possibility. The ability to imagine yourself somewhere else, someone else doing something new. When Sony stayed close to that belief, it thrived. When it drifted into protecting structures instead of serving experience, it stalled. The company's history is not a straight line. It is a pulse, expansion, contraction, recalibration. And this is where the story does not end, because the most revealing chapter is not Sony's inventions, but how it learned to survive its own contradictions, how it chose which identities to shed and which to preserve, and how the company that once defined consumer electronics learned to let go of being everything in order to remain something meaningful. As the sentence continues into the next phase, where legacy focus and reinvention collide, and the journey moves forward without pause into what comes next, where reinvention stopped being optional and became an act of survival, because by the time Sony entered the 2010s, the world it once helped invent no longer waited for its permission. Smartphones ate cameras, streaming devoured discs. Software companies dictated experiences once defined by hardware. Sony, the company that taught the world how to listen, watch, and play, now had to decide whether it would cling to the idea of being everything or finally accept that focus was the only way forward. This was a painful reckoning. Sony had to admit that some battles were already lost, not because it lacked capability, but because it had arrived too late with too much internal friction. Entire businesses were sold, spun off, or quietly deprioritized. This kind of shrinkage looks like weakness from the outside. From the inside, it is clarity earned through exhaustion. Sony learned the hard way that innovation without alignment collapses under its own weight. You cannot be brilliant in 10 directions if none of them fully trust each other. What saved Sony was not a new gadget, but a return to first principles. Where does Sony still shape emotion at scale? Where does it still control experience end to end? The answer was no longer everywhere. It was gaming, imaging, and entertainment. PlayStation became the anchor, not just as a console, but as an ecosystem, where hardware, software, content, and community finally moved in the same direction. Sony stopped apologizing for not being Apple. It stopped chasing Google. It leaned into what it uniquely understood: immersion storytelling and the emotional gravity of play. The PlayStation division thrived because it never forgot why Sony existed in the first place. Games are not utilities. They are worlds. Music and film followed a similar logic. Sony Pictures and Sony Music stopped being vanity acquisitions and became strategic pillars once the company accepted that content was not a side dish to hardware, but a core expression of its identity. Cameras and sensors quietly became another pillar, not for consumers alone, but for the machines and systems that now see the world. Again, Sony didn't chase headlines. It chose relevance. This phase of Sony's life teaches a lesson that founders rarely want to hear. Sometimes the bravest innovation is subtraction. Letting go of categories you once defined feels like betrayal. In reality, it is respect for what you still do best. Sony didn't abandon imagination. It narrowed the surfaces where imagination could still win. That restraint restored momentum. Today's Sony is not the loud, cultural monolith it once was, and that is precisely why it is healthier. It no longer tries to teach the world how to live with technology. It partners in specific moments where experience matters most. Play, create, capture. That focus doesn't make headlines like a new Walkman once did, but it pays the bills and preserves the soul. From radios to PlayStation, the real through line of Sony's history is not invention, but willingness to reevaluate its own identity under pressure. When Sony believed technology existed to unlock emotion, it led. When it believed technology existed to protect structure, it stalled. And when it finally accepted that it could not be everything without becoming nothing, it found a sustainable shape again. For anyone building today, Sony's story is a warning and a comfort at the same time. A warning that past brilliance buys you no immunity. A comfort that reinvention does not require erasing who you are, only clarifying it. Sony survived not by outrunning disruption, but by deciding which parts of itself were worth carrying forward into a smaller, sharper future. And if this journey through Sony's history made you rethink what long-term innovation really demands, stay with this channel. Subscribe, because this is where we talk about companies that didn't just rise, but endured. And leave a comment sharing which era of Sony resonated with you most, because the technologies that shape us often mirror the phases of our own lives, moments of expansion, confusion, correction, and renewed focus.